Interesting discussion now. Illustrator and designer Masonwabe Ntloko has launched his latest project, a knitwear range titled Ameva Ayabangulana. The unisex collection was inspired by the shared experiences of childhood, despite the fact that people actually come from different cultural identities. The collection of individual pieces made from 100% cotton are printed with African symbols and motifs. He joins us now in studio to speak to us a bit more about this interesting project, and I'm struggling to find other words because it's very intriguing. Masonwabe, thanks for popping by, and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. Where do we begin? Perhaps let's start with definitions. Ameva Ayabangulana. I thought it was isiZulu, but also you helped me realize that it's deep in Xhosa. What does it mean?
It's called, there's something in Xhosa, there's things in Xhosa that are called amakalo. So it's one of them, right? So what this means in direct translation is it takes a thorn to pick out another thorn, which would be from like a person's flesh if you're walking barefoot, right? That's what it means directly, but it speaks on the power of community. That's basically the meaning of it if you actually,
Sure, that's interesting. In my mind, it's also got very strong kind of visual references to the act of knitting, right? This idea that, you know, you need that kind of motion in order to get something like what you're wearing, right?
Yes. So I think in the process of creating all of this, you know, usually you create. Sometimes you create with a title in mind. Sometimes you create and then you don't have a title in mind. So for me, when the body of work was already done, I was like, okay, I need something that will speak to the fact that this is a knitwear collection, and also something that will speak to what I'm trying to talk about. And that was how I came up with the name.
So let's distill that conversation. What are you trying to raise?
So for me, the most important thing that I'm trying to do, like for the people that have been following my work, they will know that I'm very, very unapologetic about black representation on stuff that we consume. Because if you look at it in things like fashion, for example, like you don't really see a lot of black imagery on T-shirts. You don't see black imagery. You see what I mean? So for me, that's what my work is mostly about. Obviously, the foundation of it is who I am and where I come from, which is a cultural background.
Right. And, you know, I'm hoping we'll be able to speak a bit more about that because it's a bold move, right? This idea to imagine something that doesn't exist yet, especially in fashion, because you don't know how people are going to receive that.
Here's the thing, right? I function, I guess, in a weird way. I don't think I'm entitled to people's anything. So I create from where I create from, and I put it out in the world. It's the world's decision to decide how they're going to take it, you know. So I can't sit here and say this is what you're supposed to do. But I do feel like what I do is I'm trying to tell stories of our people, which are not stories that we hear on an everyday basis, you know. So that for me is what's mostly important.
Sure. Those stories are beautiful, but sometimes they get messy. They're not linear at all. They're homogenous. Sometimes they're contested terrain. People have different versions of events of how those stories actually look and ways through which they should be represented. How do you sift through all of that to find your own voice so that, again, you're able to produce something like what you're wearing?
But think about it like this, right? For me, I think everyone is entitled to their own way of looking at things and their own beliefs, right? I am telling stories about who I am and where I come from. It's mostly a general story, but the foundation is based on my experiences. So I can't sit here and say, this is what this person did. This is what, I'm just talking about this is what my experiences are, and this is how I experienced this person, that person, this and this and this and this and this. And that's what made me who I am today.
All right. So let's speak a bit more about that story. You've shared that you're from Eastern Cape.
Yes.
Deep Eastern Cape, whatever that means. And I'm only going there because I'm sure it's going to inform your interpretation of what black representation looks like.
So I think for me, obviously when you start when you get to a point you're like, okay, now I'm about to introduce myself to the world. You have to sit down and actually think about what you want to talk about, who you want to talk about. Obviously, like everybody else, my initial works were very much inspired by what's happening today. But that doesn't make you, you know.
Masonwabe, apologies. Let me interrupt you there. Let's continue our discussion here at our Randburg studios. We're joined once again by Masonwabe Ntloko, who is an illustrator and designer, as we try, I suppose, pull apart and put together what goes in your mind when you put together some of the work that you have, including that illustration on you now? And your background plays a big part in that. That's what you're still explaining.
Yeah. So a lot of what I do is heavily inspired by where I grew up, how I grew up, because I think when you do all of these things, you start the moment you leave home, that's where you start appreciating home. Like for me, I didn't even understand that I had any amount of knowledge when it came to like cultural, traditional stuff. But as soon as I started having conversations with other people, I started realizing that this was the foundation of who I am, actually. These are the things that I was taught when I was younger, which is what I'm trying to somewhat like teach, but teach in an artistic way.
Yeah. Culture is always evolving, and I suppose there's a discussion about how far we take things, even in fashion. Is that something you've had to grapple with?
Yes. But because my belief is that culture is always evolving, and my dream is to somewhat contribute, because I don't just always want to take away, but I also want to contribute into culture. And as it progresses, like if you really think about it, there was a time where fabric wasn't a thing, but now traditional Xhosa regalia is known as imibhaco and all of these things, Like there was a point where the glass beads were not a thing, but now they've become part of culture. So my goal is to also contribute with the work that I create, because it pays homage, but it also looks at culture in a progressive manner. Yeah.
This particular project is around capturing our shared childhood experiences, even though we all come from very different cultural identities. Who's it targeted at, do you reckon?
Okay, my actual target audience for my work, my initial target audience, because it's growing now, that's the most interesting thing, which is why I'm very mindful of how I price my product. As much as I don't compromise on quality, but I try as hard as I can to make sure that it's affordable for someone around my age group. Because my initial target audience was, I'm going to say, from 20 to like 35. So most of those people are doing entry-level jobs, midway jobs, which means if I do a product which might look very beautiful and I sell it for 20, 30, 40,000 rand, it makes no sense, because the people that love and support the work that I do cannot afford it, you know. So what I decided to do was I tried as hard as I can to make sure that everything that I create is somewhat accessible. Right. So with that, obviously, then the more you build your product, the more you build your brand, the more people start knowing who you are. So now my target audience has diversified. So now I'm still pushing the way I'm pushing, in terms of understanding that this is who my target audience is, or these are the people that started this with me. So which is why for me, the importance of community is the biggest thing. So when I create, I don't create for the people that don't know me yet. I usually create for the people that know me, because those are the people that are the foundation of what you're doing.
That's interesting, because, I suppose, look, South Africa's got a very interesting story when it comes to like our fashion and our textile industry, right? This idea of whether or not government did enough to ensure that we're able to survive in the face of really stiff competition from outside, right? People were able to produce things en masse, way cheaper, and dumping them essentially in the country. That kind of stance you've taken to make sure it's good quality at an affordable rate in the context I've just described, how difficult is it to keep that going?
It's hard, but also remember, for me, what I was mostly interested in was building a visual language. So that means I'm more of a visual artist than I'm not a fashion designer. Right. I studied textile designing, you see. But what I do is it can work on anything. So, for example, my first offering was rugs, you see. So I'm able to move rugs, Right, okay. So I'm able to move around, different spaces, which some spaces might not require as much capital when you create a product, So, for example, I also paint. So the beauty about paintings is that you can sell one painting for like 100,000 rand. Because it's a one-of-one piece, it was made on this paper, all of those things. So that then becomes the foundation of me producing the stuff that I produce. So which is why a lot of what I do is self-funded, because I'm able to host an exhibition, the money I make from the exhibition, because I invest all the money that I make back into what I do. So I'm able to do an exhibition. After I do the exhibition, that's the money that funds projects like this. So it's not really like, I'm able to figure it out. I think that's the best way to say it.
Teach us your ways, because it's a great sweet spot to be able to find. One project essentially feeding the other. Thank you so much for popping by. It's been lovely chatting to you, and all the very best as you continue, I suppose, challenging our way of thinking through different illustrations. Masonwabe Ntloko is an illustrator and designer. His latest offering there being Ameva Ayabangulana. Once again, thanks for popping by.